Okay, unfortunately, before we can continue and start actually modifying the application a bit more, we have to learn a little bit about databases, not too much. The four following things are what we're going to be covering: what tables are, what primary keys are, what foreign keys are, and some basic link, which I'll explain what that is in a moment. Okay, so tables. Tables are an object in databases, and models represent tables. So if you recall, we created a model called notes. That by entity framework is automatically converted into a table. It does the mappings for us. Tables are database objects, as I said, that store information that we add, update, and it removes information if we delete it from the table, and it persists that information. So even if we close the application, that information will still be there and accessible. Each row in a table has a unique data set and represents an object's values, and rows are also called records. So, and columns in the table are the attributes. So that might be confusing by just saying the definition. So let's actually look at what's happening. So if we look on the left, we see we created a model called employee. And employee has the following attributes: employee number, name, age, department, and salary. We also specified what type of information is stored in each of those attributes via the attribute type. Employee number is a string type, name is a string type, age is an integer or a number, department is a string, and salary is an integer. So if we look to the right, we'll see that employee number has 001, 002, 003, but if we had a specific naming convention for employee numbers, it could be A01. That's why we kept it as a string, in case the different departments wanted to have a unique naming convention later on for their employees. For the name of the employee, we had Alex X. So as you can see, these are all text values or string values. Age is always a number. Department is always a word or a string, and salary is always a number, as is specified in our model. And the actual data for each of the employees is a row. So Alex X S, if you look to the left of that column, you'll see it's his employee number that's associated with him, and if you look to the right, you'll see his age, department, and salary. So each record is unique. So the columns store a specific data type and also specify the name. So if you look at the top, we see the top of the table, we see the actual names of each of the columns, which are mapped to the attribute names in our model that we just covered. Okay, so let's actually look at that for real. So let's open up SQL Server, SQL Server Management Studios, and connect to our database, the database that is running behind our application. Because we created notes earlier, if you remember. Let's connect. Go to the database. Go to our From Scratch app database. In our Object Explorer, I expanded the databases folder by pressing the minus sign, the plus sign, and making it a minus. And now I expanded the databases folders to see what's inside it by pressing the plus sign. Now let's view the tables by doing the same thing. And we see our notes table. So within the tables folder, we see a bunch of tables. And these are what the first 7 tables are what was created by Identity Framework and is automatically used to store user information. So we didn't create those models. That was created for us. So as you can see, there's information. If you right-click on that table and select top 1,000 rows, you'll see the information that was created for my test account. Now let's look at the notes. table. So right click on the notes table, select 1000 rows, first 1000 rows, and as you can see, we have created a single note in our application, and that was hello world. So if we were to start up our application again and log in as the test user, so I pressed play in Visual Studios and it should open up in my browser. Okay, and then we log in. And then we go to notes. As you can see, we have one note, and that's hello world. If we were to create another note, let's call it new note and description, and create it. Now we have 2 rows of information, or 2 notes. And if we go back to our database table to see what happened, by re-executing this query, so just press the execute button at the top of SQL Server Management Studios, you'll see that there are 2 rows in that table now, which is the data we just added. Okay, so I hope that's clear for what a table is and how it stores information from our application and how each table is actually mapped to a model class. And our model class in this situation or scenario was the notes model. And we have an ID column, a title column, and a description column. Now if we look at the table, we have an ID column, a title, and a description. Okay, so now the next definition we should be aware of is primary key. In database terminology, a primary key is a chosen column with a unique value. So each row in a table will have a unique value for a primary key. The .NET compiler automatically chooses the ID column, or if you want to use a different type of syntax, the class name with an ID at the end of it. So that would be, in the case of our notes column, if we wanted to use, currently we have the ID column defined, and this automatically was chosen as primary key, but we could have also used the following, and the .NET compiler would have automatically made it our primary key. But we didn't. Sorry, that would be set. And if the ID column didn't exist, note's ID would be chosen as the primary key because that's the name of our model, note. Okay, so you must define a primary key column for every model, or the .NET compiler, when running your program, will throw an error. You could specify a primary key in your model that has a different name from the automatically chosen names as well, but you have to specify that. But we won't be doing that. So in the case of our table, notes, our ID column is our primary key. And as you can see, each value in the table has a different value. So each row in the table has a different value. So the first value is 2, the second value is 3. And finally, foreign keys. A foreign key is used to define a relationship between records in 2 different tables. A foreign key always points to the primary key of another table and must be defined. The name of a foreign key can be different from the primary key it points to. You, however, have to specify the relationship. So what does this mean? If we had another table, let's say create table, don't worry about understanding this SQL Server syntax, because we won't be getting into it that much later on. And we had a column, int primary key. And then we had another attribute. Let's say we wanted it to point to the notes ID. So for every employee, we want it to be associated with the notes. Int. And then we say foreign key, and it points to the table of notes. And then we'd specify the column, which would be its ID column. That's not the actual right syntax, but I wanted to make it write it in a way that would be more clear to someone that didn't understand it. So we have a table and employees with its own primary key, because each table or model has to have a primary key associated with each of its rows. And this would always have a unique value. And it's associated with the note. So as you can see, we have a column in notes called ID. So we say that this attribute in the employee table is associated with this foreign key. It's a foreign key that points to a unique record in our notes table. And consequently, the value of this column would always have to be a value in our notes table. Otherwise, it wouldn't allow us to add that value to that model. It'll throw an error. So I hope that made sense. But if it doesn't, don't worry, because it'll make sense in a moment when we're actually utilizing it. That's why I'm covering it right now. And finally, link. You might be wondering what link is. Link is the language that Entity Framework uses to query the database from the C# layer. It has a unique syntax that differs from the querying language that is used directly with databases. You access the database table's information via a controller using the application DB context object that is passed into the controller in the constructor. We'll look at that in a moment. Recall how we defined the models we wanted mapped to tables in the application DB context class we created. So let's take a look at Visual Studios and see what I'm talking about. So we have the notes class, or the notes model, and in our application DB context, we specified that the note dataset is actually a table. And as you can see, if we look at our database, the table name is notes. And the name we defined for the DB set, or the model of note, is notes. Okay, so now we know that our application DB context is where we define which models are tables. Now let's go to our notes class and notice that in our constructor we pass in an application DB context object. This is our connection to the database. So in our context object later on, we utilize, whenever we're working with the database, we say we access the tables through our application DB context object. And we would use a dot after the context object to specify what table we're trying to access. And then after that, we'll use a link specific language query in order to access the particular row we're looking for. So what we're just looking at is this particular line. So as you can see here, we specify after the context the table we're going to query, followed by a filter, and we're looking for n arrow n.id. So this is specifying the actual primary key of the record we're looking for is equal to id, which is the object that was passed in to that action. And then we pull the first or default value. So it'll return the first element rather than a list of elements based on our filter, or default. and default could be specified, but we're not going to get into that. So this will just use first or default in order to return the first result from a list of results in a where clause. So yeah, that might not be totally clear, but we're actually going to use it in a moment, and we'll be delving more into LINQ as time goes on. But as I said, you have to work with it to truly understand it. So don't be discouraged. Some of the material will be easy, some will be hard. But as long as you use it and process the information and think about it, you'll become very fluent in it. And we will be going into the details as we explore the code more.